My name is John Richter. I'm one of the directors here at Financial Mechanics. Welcome to this tutorial on using the index function to select data. In our experience, the index function is almost always the cleanest and best way to control scenarios, but we find that people underuse it. And on this tutorial, what I'm going to do is walk through how it works in its simplest form and how best to use it. So just to sort of set up our simple example, what we have is a situation where you have 4 production forecasts for your widget plant. What we've called a base case profile, some sort of high scenario, some sort of conservative case, and a sort of special year 2 outage. And what we want to do is set up in our model so that we can simply pick one of those scenarios by putting in the integer 1, 2, 3, or 4. We'd like to ensure that we're as fast compliant as we can be, therefore, logic that is simple, readable, and resistant to errors. And ideally as well allow for easy adaptation as we expand potentially in the future for more scenarios and just modifications to the model in general. So if we imagine this setup in an Excel scenario, you'll see here that we have 4 series input ranges reflecting each of the different production scenarios and some sort of cell that we anticipate using to control those scenarios. And what I expect some of you may have seen, which is kind of almost the worst option possible, is to simply use a nested if construction. Testing, if this control cell is equal to 1, then pick the first row. If it's equal to 2, pick the second row, and you get this basic horror that I expect some of you have seen and possibly even used yourself. So we pick the second one if it's equal to 2, otherwise if, and you get the idea. I'm just going to sort of finish this off. That's equal to 3. Then we get the third row, otherwise the fourth row, and then you sort of sit there and you kind of count up how many parentheses you've got opening it up, and you kind of guess at the end here and hope that that works. And you basically hope that formula works. And this is an unsatisfying way to approach this problem for a host of reasons, not least of which is it's very difficult to understand and get confident that everything is lined up well. A difficult formula to modify with confidence, and just generally is not particularly scalable. But it will work. I mean, at least it demonstrates a conclusion, and it meets the objective, I suppose, of driving from this single input cell. But the difficulty, and I suppose I should see if it even works, it looks like we're picking the row total 16034 there. So if I change this to 2, one hopes that we see 18706 for a row total down here at the end. So it looks like it's working, but you can see not particularly fast compliant on a number of fronts. And maybe we'll even kind of make it clear that we're not happy with this, kind of call this variant the nested if horror. I think that properly describes it. So from that position, let's see if we can create a slightly better form. Let me go ahead and take a copy of this calculation block just to sort of reuse elements of it. And let's just sort of look like a better way. And the better way that we're going to look at least to start with, is to use the index function in its simple incarnation. And the way it works is to use a sort of under-recognized subcomponent of the many varieties that you can have with an index function. And if we switch to the Excel help here for a second, just to kind of focus on what we're talking about, what we notice here is that in the array form, which is in itself kind of a complicated, scary-looking indication, there is the ability just to simply put in a range of cells as the first argument. And the crucial thing is this first bullet. If the array contains only one row or column, the corresponding row number or column number argument is optional. Very confusing to kind of try to determine what that quite means. But the important thing is to start with a presumption that this is how you were going to use the index function. Only pick a single dimensional, kind of a single line type of range argument, and then just use a single integer to pick the relevant element of that range argument. And let's just sort of see that in the context of what we're talking about. So coming back to this situation, what we would do is simply put in index, pick the range across which we're looking at, rows 1 through 4 in our sort of previous example, and simply aim at this number. Nothing more complicated than that, and copy that across. And that, as you would hope and expect, gets the job done. If I were to pick the fourth argument and do a Shift F9, we'd see that we're picking effectively 16671, which is the year 2 outage profile. And that setup, which is, I think everybody would argue, a far cleaner, more direct, and harder to mess up version, certainly, than the nested if construction, is the best way to use the index function. A single dimensional range argument with a single integer. Now, as the last step, we can do a little bit better than that, and usefully so from a standpoint of scenario management. So let me again take this section as our kind of starting position. Take a copy of that and make an indication that this will be the fast way. And the issue that crops up quite a bit, of course, is that you want to add scenarios, and you don't necessarily want to add scenarios into the middle of your range or anything. You want to kind of put your scenarios where you'd like them to be. You might take a new scenario and want to kind of put it as the fifth possibility. So if I take a copy of that row and do an insert copied cells down here for sort of base case, maybe with year 1 outage, the problem that we have, and let me first off sort of set up something that has a year 1 outage here so we can see 16,795. The problem that we have from that construction is that the range doesn't stretch automatically. Of course, we can use the edit key and kind of stretch this fellow. Let me get rid of my trace arrows, make that a little bit easier. With the mouse, one of the few things we do use the mouse for. That gets us to where we want to be, but of course, knowing that you need to do that is itself kind of, an error prone, and why go through the extra trouble. So what this indicates is the usefulness possibly of creating a kind of deliberately blank row for insertion, let's just say. Blank row for insertion. Modelers mark this different sorts of ways, but the idea that we've got here is to include that extra row here in the formula, in that range argument, so that if we were to insert stuff at the end of this sequence, so maybe we had a high version here, we'd put ourselves on that blank row for insertion, do a Shift Control plus, and essentially stretch open that range so that if we wanted high equipment availability, year 3 out, getting kind of long on our scenarios, that kind of come across here, I suppose, and try to demonstrate year 3 might have inputs like this. We would pick that as the 6th case. Now, some of you from this position are probably asking yourselves, well, what happens if other numbers are picked? If you try 0 in for the index, which by definition is never a valid integer as far as index is concerned, you get a hash value error. When you try to pick a number that's outside the range that's currently done, currently we don't have 8 possibilities, we have 7 possibilities, you actually get a hash ref error. And if you're going to use this blank row for insertion structure, which we tend to recommend, you just want to be a little bit cautious about the fact that 7 will work. It's picking that blank row for insertion, returning a bunch of zeros. Sometimes modelers will put something into that blank row for insertion in order for those pieces of data, those text strings perhaps, to kind of feed through and presumably blow up the model and not leave you with using zeros, which some of you guys might argue is somewhat more dangerous than feeding text strings in, which are almost certainly going to be a problem in the context of this widget production scenario idea. So there we have basically recommended setups for using the index function to select scenarios. And I suppose we should leave ourselves with something reasonable looking, for instance picking the second scenario, which should return that 18706, the high equipment availability. As when you get kind of longer lists, of course you can make a kind of position of perhaps marking somewhere the kind of sequence, which scenario that you're actually talking about in some fashion. So you'd kind of focus on the 6 valid scenarios in our particular case here, 1 through 6, potentially somehow indicated near each of the scenario rows. So just to turn back to our slides and take a look at what we've managed to achieve, we've certainly abandoned and recommending you abandon the nested if constructions. I also wanted to make the point that not all forms of index are particularly smart to use. There are some extremely complicated, in my opinion, interpretations of index, both with the array and what's known as the reference form of use, and that I want to focus you guys on just using that range argument with a single dimensional element and a single number for which element in that range that you pick. Also, it's worth making the point that there are alternatives to using the index function that are commonly used, including lookup variant functions, sometimes SUMIF. They're almost always more complicated and less preferred, in our opinion, than using the index function. And we'll touch on those functions in subsequent videos. I want to make the point as well to take advantage of the index's use of the range argument, which is different from choose, for instance, that allows us to set up a construction where we can stretch to add new scenarios. Though that said, there are circumstances where the choose function, which allows us to pick kind of scenarios that are not contiguous, separate things, in those layouts may be preferred. We'll talk more about that again on other videos. And finally, I'd just like to make a note that the index is often used in combination with the XL match function, which essentially allows us to generate that integer that we're talking about, that we're feeding the index function with. And that will be kind of a core component, again, of a subsequent video. So that's about what we have to say about the index function on this video. Hope you guys found it useful, and we'll look forward to you tuning in on subsequent videos. Bye for now.